The 1968 Democratic National Convention had been marred by violent clashes between police and protesters outside the arena, but the Democratic National Committee was almost as concerned as what had happened inside the arena, where a antiquated and unregulated system had not only led to nasty floor battles, but the nomination of a candidate, Hubert Humphrey, that hadn't won a single primary. In the midst of that, the Democratic National Committee decided to create a commission to reform the way that they chose their candidate. And the first test of that new system was in the 1972 convention held in Miami. And what they found out was, as with other new systems, there were still a few kinks to work out. Well, it was certainly different than 1968, but you could only really say of the 1972 Democratic National Convention was that it was a different kind of chaos. Presidential historian Tevi Troy explained in the journal National Affairs that the party convention system arose from the growing complexity of American politics. The lack of a formal process was all well and good when the entire nation could agree on the candidacy of George Washington, but it became ever more difficult as the divided populace struggled over difficult issues such as trade alliances, European revolutions, wars, and slavery. The issue was that the previous caucus system often failed to provide consensus, and so candidates were overlooked, or, as with the divided Federalist Party in 1820, no candidate was fielded at all. Troy continues, conventions had become necessary because parties were becoming more robust and active, and party leaders increasingly needed to get together to plan and coordinate. With the convention precedent established, parties now had a mechanism for selecting candidates, with the input of party members from across the growing country. That input, however, was not originally the democratic process of primary elections. Instead, a system of caucuses was used to select delegates who came to the convention not pledged to a particular candidate. Sometimes candidates were obvious, but at the start of most conventions in the 19th century, the party candidate was far from a foregone conclusion. Nominations were the result of horse trading among party officials in a process that was at best opaque. At most conventions, Democrats applied a two-thirds majority rule, requiring that two-thirds of delegates agree to choose a candidate. This gave relatively more power to blocks of delegations, a power that was particularly wielded by states from the South. It also made the nomination a contentious process, and often several ballots were required before a candidate could be chosen. Woodrow Wilson was nominated in 1912 only after 46 ballots. A deadlock between supporters and opponents of prohibition, wets and dries, at the 1924 Democratic Convention took 16 days and 102 ballots before a candidate, New York Governor Al Smith, could finally be chosen. And that rule was finally retired in 1936. But by the chaotic convention of 1968, marred both by violent conflict between police and protesters in the streets of Chicago and by infighting, floor battles inside the convention, underscored the need for reform. The issue wasn't just the violence of the police response to protests that had marred the party image, but the entire process. Vice President Hubert Humphrey had been nominated without winning or even participating in a single primary. And even in states where primaries were held, delegates were often not obligated to vote for the candidate who had won the primary when they got to the convention. Arguments over credentials and delegates had seated delegations that were perceived to have excluded, or at least not sufficiently represented, minorities. Traditional party bosses seemed to have too much power. As an investigation would later conclude, in at least 20 states, there were no, or at least inadequate, rules for the selection of convention delegates that essentially left the entire process to the discretion of a handful of party leaders. During the chaos of 1968, the convention voted in the name of giving all Democratic voters a full, meaningful, and timely opportunity to participate in the selection of the nominee, to direct the Democratic National Committee to form a commission to reform the primary process. Political historian Theodore White explained in his 1973 book, The Making of a President. On the hot and muggy night of August 27, 1968, in total confusion and a fit of absent-mindedness, the Democratic Party began what was to be a revolution in the structure of the oldest living political party in the world. Ironically, the head of the Democratic National Committee who would take that charge was appointed by the party nominee, Hubert Humphrey, the very symbol of the system that the party hoped to reform. The man he chose to lead the DNC was Senator Fred Harris of Oklahoma. To head this new commission on delegate selection and party structure, Harris chose South Dakota Senator George McGovern. McGovern was well liked, but more than that, he was seen as a person to be trusted. And although he had been among the anti-war doves that opposed Humphrey at the 1968 convention, White writes that he had campaigned manfully for Humphrey against Nixon in the fall. Also, and important for the leader of this commission, White writes that no one considered McGovern a serious presidential contender. so there would be no charges that the changes recommended were self-serving. There are various ways to describe the commission. Political historian Jamie Sanchez Jr., in a 2022 edition of the Journal of Policy History, argued that the institutional motive was actually to build up the legitimacy and authority of the National Committee. But the committee worked to address a number of issues with a delegate selection that essentially allowed small groups or local leaders to select delegates largely behind closed doors. The guidelines set forward by the commission worked to make formerly closed caucuses more open and to increase the prevalence of binding primaries. But there was also a goal of changing the makeup of state delegations. An area of particular concern was the so-called unit rule, which allowed a majority of a state delegation to require that all delegates support the same candidate, even if other candidates had won a significant portion of the primary votes. Facing opposition, however, the commission urged, but did not require, states to recognize minority views, rather than use a winner-take-all system, a decision that would loom large in the 1972 convention. But as the unit rule regarded votes for minority candidates, the commission took on a more difficult concept: representation of minority groups. The commission wanted to increase representation by race, for women and for younger voters. The commission required states to take affirmative steps to encourage representation of minority groups on the national delegation in reasonable relationship to the group's presence in the population of the states. This was applied not just to race, but also to women and to young people between 18 and 30 years of age. The rules brought order and opened the nomination process and were adopted by the National Committee, although by that point George McGovern, the man that few considered to be a serious presidential contender, had left the committee to mount a campaign for the nomination. He was replaced on the commission by Minnesota Representative Donald Frazier, and the committee is commonly called the McGovern-Frazier Commission. The rules would have a profound effect upon the U.S. nomination process, the Democratic Party, and a man whose name the commission bore. The 1972 Democratic primary system is considered to be the first modern primary in the United States. It had clarified, codified, and opened the systems by which candidates were selected, but at a cost: white rights. The reform rules of the McGovern Commission had been the consequence of the Chicago Cataclysm, and thus the convention of 1972 was to be an effort to include in the convention process, at one gulp, by untried procedures, all the new claimant groups, exerting the pressure of all the new ideas of the 60s, and the open presence of national television, which had now arrived at maturity. While the guidelines had clarified the process, they didn't heal divisions within the party. 5 state primary elections had been won by George Wallace, who, although he had softened his segregation stance, opposed federally mandated desegregation via busing. Wallace had been the victim of an assassination attempt in May that had left him paralyzed and effectively ended his presidential bid. Establishment candidate and 1968 nominee Hubert Humphrey had won 4. Other contests were split between a number of candidates, including New York's Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to run for a major party's nomination. But the largest number of state primaries and contests had been won by George McGovern, once considered a dark horse candidate who had run on an anti-war platform, a popular position versus Republican incumbent Richard Nixon, who had won in 1968 promising to end the war but had failed to do so. But McGovern's nomination was not guaranteed. If his opponents could prevent him winning a majority on the first ballot, then the convention would be brokered. And a coalition that included Humphrey and Wallace and rising star Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, supported by traditional constituencies like organized labor, convinced that McGovern's platform did not represent a true majority of the party, pressed an Anyone But McGovern, or ABM, campaign. Key to that campaign was the California delegation. McGovern had won the most votes in the primary, but had only won 44% of the votes. If the delegates were apportioned proportionately rather than as a block, McGovern might lack the votes for a first ballot win. The first difficulty came in the Credentials Committee, where the battles would be fought. The new rules had led to an unprecedented number of challenges. The vote could swing on these challenges, among them the challenge to the California block vote. With the California representatives on the committee unable to vote on the question, the ABM crew had a majority on the committee. McGovern was only awarded 120 of the state's 271 delegates, despite the voting laws of California. The next day, a challenge to 59 delegates from Cook County, selected by Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, that had supported the California decision, faced retaliation. Now, with their representatives on the committee unable to vote, the McGovern people held sway and replaced them with an alternate slate that included Jesse Jackson, but which had not clearly been elected by the people of Cook County. Thus, the open convention already smelled of the unseemly insider deal-making that the McGovern-Frazier Committee was supposed to prevent. The McGovern team worked to overcome the ABM group in a floor vote over the issue. They guaranteed a majority in the vote based on a convention chair decision that would exclude the anti-McGovern California delegates from the vote, but not the 120 McGovern delegates. McGovern won the vote, ensuring that he had the delegates to win the nomination. But the openness of the convention was already not working in his favor. He had led the commission that was to end backroom deals, and yet had secured the nomination on exactly that type of deal. And he had secured the nomination through the block rule that the commission bearing his name had discouraged. Then came the rest of the convention. Editor Andrew Glass of Politico wrote of the convention, previously excluded political activists who adored McGovern and loathed the Vietnam War dominated the political scene at the expense of elected officials and traditional core Democratic constituencies, such as organized labor, which had largely run the show at prior conventions. But with these new faces came the challenge: white rights. Open debate exposed for millions of Americans thoughts, ideas, proposals which had for decades been swept into the dark rooms of their culture and there locked up. The debates were wide-ranging and sometimes challenging. The New York Times reported there were divisive platform battles over Vietnam, abortion, welfare, and court-ordered busing to end racial discrimination. The eventual platform was probably the most liberal one ever adopted by a major party in the United States. For example, in 2020, Elle magazine discussed a proposed Rights of Women plank. In matters relating to human reproduction, each person's right to privacy, freedom of choice, and individual conscience should be fully respected, consistent with relevant Supreme Court decisions. The plank represented a political lightning rod. The New York Times reported that the McGovern supporters were convinced that if the pro-abortion minority plank was adopted, it would brand the South Dakota senator an extremist. Moreover, there was a concern that McGovern opponent George Wallace was pressing delegates to support the plank specifically to embarrass McGovern. The Times writes, the McGovern forces were moving around the floor, urging delegates to vote against the plank. In the end, they won, and it was jettisoned. Feminist delegate Gloria Steinem felt betrayed. Near hysteria, Elle writes, Gloria burst into tears before the television cameras and rushed down the aisle. And these debates were not just showing party divisions, they were taking up a great deal of time. White rights, delegates, leadership, press, commentators all doggedly held on and on at the convention hall, as the philosophy of open politics dedicated that everyone have a say. And over time, slowly the weight of exhaustion pressed in. One 4:15 a.m. vote by the Kentucky delegation read, the Kentucky vote is 36 yes, 10 no, and 1 asleep and not voting. The Birmingham New York Press and Sun Bulletin reported that all told there are 20 minority challenges to the platform, ranging from Wallace's anti-busing substitute to gay liberation's plank endorsing sexual freedom. According to Democrat General Counsel, including all the minority proposals will take 10 to 13 hours. On Thursday came the vice presidential nomination. McGovern had chosen Missouri Senator Thomas Eagleton. But, White notes, open politics now required another delay, as 6 hopeless nominees for vice president insisted on pressing their symbolic or publicity causes from the podium. By the time that was done, White writes, it was late, very late, 12:38 by the clock, and a silly giddiness swept the floor. There were votes for Humphrey and Wallace, a grassroots movement for the women's caucus candidate Texas delegate Frances Farenthold, but also for 6 people who were dead, pediatrician Benjamin Spock and fictional character Archie Bunker. A vote for Chinese Party Chairman Mao Zedong was recorded, although the Lancaster, Pennsylvania New Era suggests that the vote was actually misunderstood and was for Colorado Lieutenant Governor Robert Mondragon. By the time the voting, which went to over 75 candidates, was over and Eagleton selected, McGovern gave his keynote speech accepting the nomination, a speech he described as the best of his life, at 2:48 a.m., when most watching, even on the West Coast, had already turned in. The 1972 Democratic National Convention was not marred by the violence that it had been in 1968. Both police and protesters seemed to have realized that that violence had only hurt their causes, and that was relatively muted. It did represent some political firsts. It initiated discussions of some topics that had previously been hidden, and it opened up the democratic process to new audiences. But the nasty floor battles, the long hours, and the discussion of topics with which the American public was, well, just not yet comfortable meant that the New York Times said the 1972 convention in Miami was a disastrous start to the general campaign. It was a difficult election year against an incumbent president, and the McGovern campaign did face difficulty almost immediately as Thomas Eagleton was forced to resign when it was revealed that he had been treated for depression, including electroshock therapy. It's really not clear how much a role the 1972 convention played in that general election, but Glass argued in Politico that the tumultuous conclave had helped move the minds of many undecided voters to propel Richard Nixon to his landslide victory. George McGovern famously said of the reforms that he had done so much to lead, "I opened the doors of the Democratic Party, and 20 million people walked out." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.